So today's session is being recorded as of this minute. And we're also offering live Arabic to English and English to Arabic interpretation. So if you'd like to listen in Arabic or English, given depending on what language the speaker is speaking in, you can click the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar and select your preferred language. And you can switch during the session. Please feel free to post your questions at any time using the Q&A button in the Zoom toolbar. We'll be drawing on those in the discussion. A quick word about the two organizations that have put together this series. APSN is a professional network dedicated to supporting and connecting social scientists from the Arab world and working in the Arab region. Its mission is to really connect these scholars and researchers inside and outside the region to create inclusive, accessible spaces for critical and policy-relevant scholarship. APSN also works to amplify voices that have often been relegated or marginalized in both academic and public discourse, and we try to bring in conversations that sort of transcend the silos of these two regional areas. We're also pleased to be partnering with the Arab Reform Initiative, which is an independent think tank that supports locally grounded research and dialogue on democratic reform, governance, and accountability across the Arab world. You'll find links to both organizations in the chat. This series emerges from a recognition that in conversations that we've had with Ari, that in moments of political transition, questions of institutional design, justice, reconstruction, political economy, governance are both urgent and deeply contested. Our aim throughout this series is to center Syrian scholarly expertise, and in designing the series itself, we drew on a number of Syrian experts in different fields, and to put it into dialogue with comparative cases and experiences. It's not a space intended to produce ready-made policy decisions or solutions, but rather one that aims to situate Syria within a broader global conversation, to think about what comparative scholarship can offer Syria, but just as importantly, what Syria can teach us about the limits and challenges of our given explanations and pathways of politics of transition. So today's session is focused on the domestic political economy of Syria's transition. It's one of two sessions that we'll be doing on political economy questions. This one is particularly focused on internal and domestic questions, although it's very hard to disentangle, obviously, the external impacts of that. And it explores the evolving role of the state, the impact of neoliberal reforms, dynamics of war-related and crony capitalism, and uneven patterns of participation and exclusion emerging in reconstruction. So really a central question that we all have here today is what kind of political economy is being restructured in Syria and for whom? I'm really honored that Nadim Hodi, the executive director of ARI, wanted to moderate this discussion, as this is also an issue that he's particularly engaged in and interested in. So thank you, Nadim, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lama, and really, we're very happy to be partnering with APSN. So marhaba jami'an. This will be a bilingual panel. Just to make sure before we start, everyone who may not be familiar, so there should be an interpretation button at the lower end of your screen on Zoom. And if it doesn't appear immediately, you should click more and you will find it. I'll do my very brief introductory remarks in English. Lama framed it very well. I mean, really what this session is about is to think about what political economy is being built today in Syria and for whom. But before we jump in, I really want to acknowledge the challenge of the moment and of even having this conversation. You know, there was very heavy fighting, with some terrible human rights violations being committed yesterday, with some reports that even today it continues. Israel bombing the presidential palace in Damascus. So, and this has actually been one of the challenges of talking about Syria's transition, is these notions of different temporalities. Are we in a post-conflict stage? It definitely doesn't feel like it. So how do we talk about a transition? And yet there are many elements of a transition, you know, so it almost feels sometimes like it's a transition acceleration, and suddenly you feel transported into different time and visual space. I mean, just last week, if you remember, the public discussion was all about normalization between Syria and Israel and what that would mean. And this would obviously have huge repercussions around the sort of political economy that's taking place in the region. And just yesterday, Israel, while they just the day before had some direct negotiations with Syria's leadership, decides to bomb Damascus, including the presidential palace. And I think this sort of whiplash, this different temporality, is the challenge of the moment of working in Syria, a sort of Gramscian interregnum period that makes it hard to project. But what I find solace in, and I think what will make this conversation particularly rich, is that really we're lucky to have panelists who have been thinking about these issues of transitions, political economy, with a sort of longer time span. So I want to sort of encourage all of us to engage, recognizing the urgency of everything, but to also look at the wider patterns of what's been happening and seeing the political economy of Syria, how it has evolved, frankly, even before 2011, and perhaps one of the reasons that 2011 erupted, how even Assad had started talking about reconstruction back in the day. No one talks about law number 10, but some of us remember this was a huge topic of discussion. And also, what is this new political economy order that the transitional authorities are trying to articulate in the midst of all of that? And again, I think the four key aspects, and Lama mentioned that, I just want to take a second, because this will really focus on the domestic aspect, is, the first is really unpacking this notion of state reconfiguration. So when we think about Syria today, what remains of the Syrian state's fiscal, regulatory, and frankly, distributive capacities, and what has actually already been privatized, captured, or devolved to a various series of network actors? The second dimension of thinking about this domestic aspect of the political economy is the neoliberal legacy, both in terms of the pre-2011 liberalization, the crony reforms in the mid-2000s, the selective market openings, but also, so that's the second dimension, because I think this also remains today and has captured, in a certain extent, the sort of imagination, but also there's a legacy of actors that we're dealing with. Three is the war-related capitalism and its aftermath, armed actors, sanctioned elites who are making a surprising comeback, obviously the issue of sanctions, investment frameworks. I already mentioned law number 10 that had already been adopted during the conflict. And how is that configured Syria's economy, and how is that affecting things like reconstruction and approaches to reconstruction today? And finally, and I think this is something that unites both APSN and RE, who is this political economy being built for? This notion of participation, exclusion, what do we know and about who is really profiting, who stands to profit, who has a seat at the table, and who's being forgotten? And the panelists who will help us answer this, I will introduce them with my first question to them. Unfortunately, we had Dr. Rasha Seroub, who was supposed to join us from Damascus, but she had a last-minute personal emergency, and she will not be able to join us. We'll have two rounds. One round where I'll give a bit more time to the speakers, and then we'll engage more in a bit of a sort of a Q&A format. So please send me your questions. In setting the stage, I want to turn to you first, Salam Saeed, who is a Syrian economist, an academic, and currently holds the position of Director of Economic Policies for Social Justice Projects at the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in MENA. And her work has not only focused on Syria and different aspects of the political economy of Syria, including impacts of sanctions, thinking of post-war reconstruction, but also has done quite a bit of work thinking about state formation, political economy, post-conflict in places like Libya and Iraq. Salam will be speaking in Arabic, so I will switch now to Arabic, so those of you who want to take a second to put your interpretation optional. شكرا سلام لانضمامك لنا. أنا حابب بلش معك بسؤال نظرا لعملك على مرحلة التحرير الاقتصادي السوري ما قبل الحرب، ويعني بزمن الحرب وسيطرة عائلة الأسد. ومحاولات الأسد السابقة للإعمار، مشاريع مثل ماروتا سيتي، القانون رقم 10، هاي المقاربات. فيك تحكينا شوي عن السياق، تنقول التاريخي السوري للمقاربة للاقتصاد السياسي اليوم، وكيف وصلنا للوضع الحالي وكيف توصفي؟
شكرا نديم على التقديم، وشكرا للشبكة العربية للعلوم السياسية ومبادرة الإصلاح العربي على الدعوة. في الحقيقة فعلا لفهم الاقتصاد السياسي حاليا، أو كيف يتشكل الاقتصاد السياسي حاليا في سوريا، من المهم أنه وضعه في سياقه التاريخي كمان، من خلال العودة إلى كيف تشكل وكيف كانت تركيبة هذا الاقتصاد ما قبل الحرب. وهون فينا نفرق بين 3 مراحل أساسية. هي مرحلة بين الستينات إلى التسعينات، يعني مرحلة ما بعد الاستقلال في سوريا أيام حافظ أسد، وهي فترة ممكن نقول عنها كانت فيها رأسمالية الدولة. لأنه الدولة كانت مسيطرة على كل مفاصل الاقتصاد، وكانت هي مسيطرة عمليًا على جميع القطاعات الاقتصادية بالفترة الأولى على الأقل من هي الفترة. ولكن النخبة الحاكمة النخبة الحاكمة المتمثلة بالعائلة الحاكمة زائد صفوف عليا من الجيش، كانوا يسيطرون على هذه المؤسسات الدولة. فإذا نحن لن نستطيع أن نقول أنها كانت دولة مؤسسات، وإنما هي كانت أكثر عبارة عن شكل مؤسساتي مسيطر عليه من أشخاص داخل مواقع القوى بالنظام اللي كان موجود، وأيضا من خلال شبكة زبائنية كبيرة. الوجه الثاني لهي المرحلة أيضا أنه كان في وجود عقد اجتماعي يضمن مستوى معين من الدخل والحماية الاجتماعية لشريحة كبيرة من المجتمع، والطبقات الفقيرة والمتوسطة كانت مستفيدة جدا من هذا النوع من العقد الاجتماعي، والذي تضمن دور الدولة بتقديم الخدمات، بناء البنية التحتية، تقديم تعليم عام، تقديم صحة عامة. فكان نوع من هذا العقد الاجتماعي أيضا موجود بهذه الفترة. هذا العقد الاجتماعي تم تمويله بشكل أساسي من الإيرادات النفطية في سوريا، لأنه سوريا كان عندها طبعا اقتصاد ريعي بسبب وفرة الإيرادات النفطية. وبالتالي فكان ممكن تمويل مثل هذا العقد الاجتماعي، بالإضافة طبعا إلى نفقات الدولة على الجيش والأمن، وأيضا على خلينا نقول تلبية حاجات الطبقة الحاكمة من فساد، وأيضا مراكمة لرأس المال. بهاي الفترة لم يكن هناك الحديث عن ما يسمى بالليبرالية بهذا المعنى التحرير التجاري، وإنما أكثر على ما يسمى بالانفتاح الاقتصادي. والانفتاح الاقتصادي كما فهم بفترة هذيك من خلال النخبة الحاكمة هنيك، تم تفسيرها. الانفتاح الاقتصادي هذا معناه أنه الدولة ممكن أنه تفتح مجال للقطاع الخاص الوطني، البرجوازية الوطنية، أنها تساهم في عملية التنمية في سوريا. ففينا نحكي فهو كان أكتر شيء بهذا الفترة بداية دخول القطاع الخاص السوري بالدرجة الأولى إلى بمشاركة مع بالاقتصاد، بإدارة الاقتصاد مع الدولة، ولكن ليس كل القطاع الخاص السوري، وإنما هو قطاع خاص منتقى، لأنه كان في رجال أعمال لهم روابط معينة مع الحكومة، هم فقط اللي كانوا قادرين أنه فعلا يستثمروا ويكونوا جزء من الطبقة الاقتصادية اللي حكمت. بعد هاي الفترة إجت عنا فترة الألفينيات، وهي فترة بشار الأسد بالدرجة الأولى، وهنا دخل الاقتصاد السياسي مرحلة جديدة كليا. صار في تسارع بالليبرالية الاقتصادية. صار في القطاعات كاملة تم خصخصتها، مثلا القطاع المصرفي ما في كان مصارف خاصة بسوريا، صار تم خصخصتها. صار في عنا انفتاح تجاري، صار في يعني توقيع عدد كبير من العقود التجارية الخارجية مع الدول العربية، مع رجعت المفاوضات مع الاتحاد الأوروبي، مع تركيا. فإذا عمليا نحن لاحظنا في تسارع بوتيرة التحرير الاقتصادي. وتم بداية بال2001 تم بداية خصخصة لبعض مؤسسات القطاع العام، ولكن لم يتم الحديث عنها بشكل كبير. فكان في نوع من الخطوات المتأنية في مجال الخصخصة تحديدا لمؤسسات القطاع العام. الملفت للنظر فيه إذا ما نحكي عن الاقتصاد السياسي، زي ما نقول من كان لديه رأس المال ليقوم أو ليشتري أو ليستثمر ويستفيد من هذا ما يسمى بالانفتاح. فهون كان في عنا فقط هن عمليا أبناء الجيل الثاني من النخبة الحاكمة، وأيضًا الطبقة اللي ما كانت موجودة العسكرية. إذا بنلاحظ أبناء مثل طلاس والّا أسماء كبيرة، هن اللي كانوا قدروا يراكموا أموال، والّا مخلوف والّا غيرها، قدروا يراكموا أموال من خلال بفترة رأسمالية الدولة، من خلال الفساد، من خلال السيطرة على موارد الدولة من الداخل، ليستثمروا كقطاع خاص وكbusiness، يعني كرجال أعمال في هذه المرحلة والاستفادة منها. بهاي المرحلة كمان فينا نلاحظ إنه هدول الناس اللي استثمروا، المستثمرين الخاصين، هم أيضًا استفادوا بشكل كبير من قربهم للطبقة الحاكمة، لأنه قدروا إنهم أيضًا يؤثروا على القرارات الاقتصادية. فإذا بنلاحظ بندرس ما هي القوانين الاقتصادية اللي خرجت خلال هاي الفترة، بنلاحظ إن هي تم تفصيلها وأيضًا هندستها خدمة مصلحة هذه الطبقة بالذات، وليست مثلًا من وجهة نظر اقتصادية بحتة أو الاقتصاد الوطني. فهذا أدى أيضًا إلى أن هذه الأعمال عملت بسوق، يعني باحتكار. مثلًا كان عندهم احتكارات كاملة بالسوق، وهذا معناه إنه عندهم أرباح كتير مرتفعة في سوق محتكرة. فهذا التزاوج بين رأس المال والسلطة مرة تانية أعاد مراكمة رأس المال ضمن للطبقة نفسها اللي كانت قبل، وأيضًا ظهر طبقة جديدة مثلًا مخلوف، أسماء جديدة، ولكن أيضًا طبقة جديدة تحالفوا مع مخلوف وغيره مثلًا للدخول إلى السوق السورية. العقد الاجتماعي بهذا المرحلة تم إهماله، وتم أيضًا تراجعه، ولذلك شعرت فيه الطبقات الفقيرة والمتوسطة بشكل كبير. تم ملاحظة صار في الفروقات الاجتماعية كبرت، الفروقات بالدخل، الفروقات بين الريف والمدينة، الفروقات بين المرأة والرجل، الفروقات داخل المدينة نفسها بين مركز المدينة والأطراف. إذًا صار طبقة الفلاحين، عمال القطاع العام والموظفين العام، حتى الجنود في الجيش السوري كانوا يعني يعملون صباحًا كجنود، وبعد الظهر سائقين تاكسي بهي الفترة، لأنه لم تكن الرواتب بما فيه الكفاية لذلك. فهناك حالة تدهور للحالة الاقتصادية الاجتماعية لطبقة كتير كبيرة، وهذا اللي مهد عمليًا للثورة اللي صارت ال 2011. وهذا ما يسمى بالنيوليبرالية، بالنموذج النيوليبرالي، لأنه من جهة تم تقليص الخدمات الدولة، يعني دور الدولة في تقديم الخدمات في البنية التحتية، يعني أيضًا تقديم الدعم الإنتاجي، حتى الدعم يعني الدعم العام للخبز، للمواد المستوردة وما إلى ذلك. ولكن لم يتم مثلًا تخفيض الدعم للطبقة اللي نحن عم نحكي عنها، وأيضًا للجهاز الأمني والجيش. فهذا النموذج النيوليبرالي اللي بلش يكتر. لمّا إجت الثورة، استمر للأسف هذا المسار الليبرالي اللي كان موجود، ولكن أضيف عليه تحدي ثاني، وهو تحدي اقتصاديات الحرب، لأنه صارت الموارد كلها تذهب بشكل أساسي لآلة الحرب، وأيضا لتمويل عملية آلة الحرب. حتى إذا ممكن نشوف انسحاب تكتيكي للجيش السوري وللدولة السورية من بعض المناطق، مثلا شمال شرق، هي أحد أسبابها كمان هو التخلي عن مسؤوليات الدولة في تقديم ما يجب أن تقديمه في هذه البلاد. آمم، النقطة المهمة كتير اللي نحكيها بموضوع اقتصاديات الحرب، من أهم يعني خلينا نقول ملامح اقتصاد الحرب، وهو الاعتماد على نشاطات اقتصادية بتعتمد على الجريمة المنظمة. عم نحكي عن إنتاج وصناعة وتصدير صناعات مثلًا المخدرات، عم نحكي عن تهريب البشر، عم نحكي عن إذا بدكم الموضوع الفدية والاختطاف. بنحكي عن في ظهور من ناحية اقتصادية بحتة قطاعات اقتصادية جديدة، مثل قطاع الترفيق، قطاع الحواجز، اقتصاديات الحواجز والمعابر كان إلى يعني بحد ذاتها اقتصاد ومورد مهم للدخل للدولة. هي المسألة الأولى. المسألة الثانية صار في عنا عقوبات، والعقوبات للأسف ما وقفت هذا الاقتصاد الحرب، وإنما عمقت اقتصاد الحرب والاقتصاد الغير المرئي وغير الشرعي واللي معتمد على الجريمة بشكل أساسي. يعني صار في طرق كيف للتهريب بشكل مختلف، رفع كلفة خلينا نقول ترانزاكشن كوست الصفقة، ولكن لم يمنع فعلا لا التجارة ولا النشاط الاقتصادي. في شيء كتير مهم صار، هو الانقسام الجغرافي اللي صار بفترة الحرب أدى إلى انقسام اقتصادي أيضا. فعمليا الاقتصاد السوري قبل الحرب بكثير كان في تمركز بين دمشق وحلب، والباقي كانت أكثر هو موردين لهدول المركزين بشكل أساسي، لأنه البقايا المناطق هي مناطق زراعية بشكل أساسي، والصناعة هي والتجارة، المركز الصناعي والتجاري هنا موجودين، أو المراكز الصناعية والتجارية موجودين بشكل أساسي بين حلب ودمشق. فإذا التقسيم هذا خلى المناطق عنا عم نحكي عن إدلب، شمال حلب، شمال الشرق، وأيضا هدول الأربع مناطق اللي كانوا موجودين مقسمين صاروا ينفصلوا شوي شوي عن المركز، وصار عندهم اتصالات اقتصادية وتجارية ونشاطات أكثر اتصالا بالمراكز الدول الجوار. يعني عم نحكي تركيا، العراق، بالجنوب شوي الأردن، لأنه كانت بسبب وجود الحرب. وللأسف يعني هدول المناطق الاقتصادية اللي تشكلت، اللي هي إلى كمان وجه يعني خلينا نقول سياسي، عملت كوبي، يعني استنسخت الموديل الاقتصادي السياسي اللي كان موجود أيام الأسد. يعني منلاحظ إنه النخبة الاقتصادية بإدلب هي نفس النخبة العسكرية، يعني هن اللي مسيطرين على المعابر، هن مسيطرين على من المستثمرين لما يجوا المستثمرين على إدلب. فهي عمليا في بنرجع تحالف بين رأس المال والطبقة النخبة العسكرية. نفس الشيء كان موجود بشمال شرق، وكمان نفس الشيء كان موجود بشمال حلب. يمكن أنا ما عاد عندي دقيقة واحدة
بس إذا
بس.
عندك 30 ثانية، إذا عندك شيء بعد حابة تزيديه أو بنرجع لبعدين.
كنت بدي حابة أحكي عن التغيرات اللي صارت من ديسمبر 24 لهلق، بس ممكن نحكي فيها بعد من الزملاء.
إيه، برجع لك على هذا الموضوع. شكرا. ويعني عملتي مهمة مستحيل، اللي هي ب10 دقائق 4 ل 5 عقود من الاقتصاد السياسي بسوريا بشكل واضح جدا. حتحول هلا عن جد الانجليزي تطرح السؤال لرينود. Renood, I'm just gonna, one of the two issues that Salam mentioned in detail, and she concluded with it, is the relationship between the political military elites and the economic elites, and how that has been a feature in Syria for a very long time, including in areas that fell outside the control of the Assad regime in the last few years. The second aspect as well is obviously this form of crony capitalism that has developed, and how sanctions have, in a way, perhaps strengthened certain features of these clientelistic networks. Now, Renoud, I should have started by introducing him, as associate professor at King's College in London, has worked a lot on the political economy of corruption, authoritarian governance, refugee issues, obviously a lot of different articles. One of my favorite books on post-war Lebanon, Spoils of Truce, Corruption and State Building in Post-War Lebanon. So I think also he'll be bringing a rich comparative perspective at a later stage. But you've done a lot of work on Syria, and I would love to hear from you about, maybe picking up where Salam left us on what you have seen, what you have observed in terms of how the transitional authorities have been dealing with this notion of business elites, and if so, which ones? There's a lot of talk about their new links with the Assad regime type elites. There's also a lot of talk in Damascus about the Idlibis, who've come down from Idlib and who are now conducting business. And obviously behind a lot of that is the how sanctions and the lifting of sanctions and but when and how is affecting a lot of these networks. And maybe that, and I'd love to hear from you maybe by the end of your answers, are we heading towards a renewal of the network cronyism of the old regime with some of the old, some of the new, and some things in between? 6, 7 minutes. We can actually have a couple of minutes more.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you for having me, Nadim, and everybody else. It's great to be on this podcast. For the last few months, when, as everybody else, being astonished and shocked by the fall of the regime, and probably shocked primarily in a positive sense, I've been working on a research project looking at international sanctions. And mainly the sanctions then imposed by the EU, the UK, and the US on Syrian individuals and entities, state entities, and companies. And actually, that gives me a bit of a background to make some reflections on what you are asking me. Because when you look at the sanctions and the list is long, you see quite a bit of individuals and companies and entities who it's an imperfect list, if you like. But we're looking at an overview of the main players in the Syria's political economy under the Assad regime. So one third about of these listings, so the individual listings. I'm not talking about these sectoral sanctions. We can maybe touch on that later. Some of them have been lifted. These individual listings are still in place. Now, about 1/3 of them are businessmen and their companies. So we see the big players featuring people like Al-Qatarji, Samir Foz, all linked to key regime incumbents like Maher al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad himself, his wife, Asma. And then you also see the smaller players like Bilal al-Na'al, Mohammed Hamshoun, Khaldoun al-Zorbi, and people like that. Now, what is striking, looking at very much at the essential features of all these businessmen, is that all of them are linked to one another. They're partnering, and they're all linked up to, in one way or another, and sometimes in very convoluted ways, to key regime figures. So the more kind of Mukhabarat style guys, the military guys, and of course the Assad family at large. Now, I think before touching on some of the things that you're asking me about, is that I think we need to look a little bit in more depth at how how all these networks were organized during the Assad years, and I think where we can start off from is with the term networked cronyism. That is what it was basically about, but it's not a static thing. It actually changes in time, and I think it's important to acknowledge these changes. Now, going back to the early stages of the conflict, the uprising, and the slowly evolution into war, there was a cronyism dominated by a very few large players, and the largest player arguably was Rami Makhlouf. And then the cronies here refer to regime-dependent businessmen, but also having some leverage of their own. They had an existence of their own. They had power and influence, so they could. Their dealings with major regime incumbents was one not of equality, but they could offer, they could make some arguments and bargain. It's a bargaining process. Now, as the war dragged on, there was the rise of businessmen, and Salam already touched on this, profiting from the war economy, including at a later stage of Captagon and illicit trade and what have you. And this caused the business landscape to fragment, if you like. New players emerged, like people like Samri Foz. And then when after 2016, the war started to turn seemingly back into the regime's favor, there was a very strong and a very energetic, if you like, regime effort to take back control of this landscape, reduce the fragmentation, re-centralize. And that was started off in hindsight. I think we can put it like that, with a conflict with Rami Makhlouf. We all remember that in 2020. It kind of peaked. It made for very good television and social media washing, but it really was about the Assad regime taking back control, and ironically at the expense first of a relative, part of the larger the ruling family, the Makhloufs, and particularly the Rami Makhlouf. So the assets that were seized in one way or another from the major players, they were being redivided among key frontmen. Now here I'm using deliberately the word frontman, following a good article by Karam Sha'ar and Stephen Heidemann, where frontmen are basically people who at least initially don't have leverage of themselves. They're not even known to the public, but they really act on behalf of others, of more powerful people. Now, an example of that is Mohammed Hamshu. But then initially they were frontmen, but they then, because of their position, start to get some leverage and influence of themselves, of their own, and tend to become more like business cronies. Now, at the same time, the Assad family, particularly Bashar and Asma, instructed one of their key allies, or indeed frontman, Yasser Ibrahim, to establish what was called the group. And this was basically an attempt to further take control of the business landscape, reshape, reorganize, centralize, essentially the distribution of rents and opportunities, economic opportunities, and steer these to the advantage of the Assads. In parallel, Maher al-Assad, using his not so subtle way of exercising power through the 4th Division, he expanded in mainly illicit activities. Not only, but that was his kind of his specialization, if you like, including the Captagon trade. Now, there was a strong overlap between these two major kind of re-centralized networks. But what they had in common is that they all used increasingly with fronts and frontmen and front women, I should say, front people. And a kind of extraordinary example is that of a front woman who acted on behalf of Yasser Ibrahim. And she didn't actually know even that she was a front woman. And then she happened to be the cleaning woman of the Yasser Ibrahim's office. Her name was put in as an owner of shares in mobile telephone companies and so on. And she only, at a very later stage, she found out that she was listed there as an owner when she was denied access to social benefits, and that caused a bit of a scandal. But you see how to the extreme they went to build up this kind of network of front men and front women. Now, the Assads essentially, I think, did what any authoritarian regime would do. They would try, some are successful and others not, to centralize these rent-seeking networks and benefit themselves as much as possible, and basically coming out on top. Now, this is, in a nutshell, the situation, the landscape that HTS encountered when it overthrew the regime in December. So it was kind of logical almost that HTS, basically, the first thing they did to start to address this situation, this landscape, was to set up office exactly in the office of Yasser Ibrahim, the leader of the so-called group, overseeing a wide kind of imperium of companies and businessmen, and that's where they started to take on the old regime cronies and frontmen. Now, what it did, the new government, the interim government, was to establish a so-called economic committee. And what is the first striking kind of characteristic of this committee, and I think it's very important to stress, is that it is entirely divorced, even institutionally, from the regime declared efforts in terms of transitional justice. So you have the Committee for Transitional Justice. They don't deal with the business companies, at least not to date. That's the job of the Economic Committee. The Economic Committee suffers from some major transparency and accountability issues themselves. Basically, their job is, as how they see it, is to start a process of deal making and bargaining with the former regime business cronies and fronts. Now, why do they do this? We don't really know, because they're not exactly talkative or in the public. But we can speculate that they basically looked at the options available. The options were, let's nationalize all these companies and bring them back under state control. That was dismissed for several reasons, I think. I think the reasoning was that would be a bad signal indication to the international financial institutions, and in contradiction with the neoliberal consensus, if you like, worldwide. It would also be resembling too much the Baath Party policies, at least in the 1960s. So that was crossed out. Then there was the option of, let's go after each and every company and businessman and take them to court. Well, the judiciary is completely paralyzed. It would take years and years and a lot of effort to do that, and so that was crossed out as well. The economic, priority was to get Syria back on its feet. The courts would take way too long to make that happen, and then so they were left with deal making and bargaining with the very kind of regime business elites. Now, to assess this committee's intentions and workings, I think a good place to start is to raise the question, who are they? And that already brings one in a very shady kind of environment. It's not clear who they are. We managed to get some bits and pieces on their background. Their names even are contested. They like to call themselves by their kunya. They call themselves Abu Ahmed, Abu Shou. So we don't, in many cases, don't actually know their real names. Nevertheless, what we did get together is a picture of at least a third or half of the committee members. We're talking about some 6 to 8 people who have a strong background in business, and that may sound good on a CV if you apply for a job, but in this case it means business in Idlib. And it means also involvement in HTS own cronyism and monopolization efforts, smuggling and what have you. So that doesn't bode very well for how they see doing business. Then the other half or third or so are very junior, just graduated law students and so on, who have very little experience. At least this is based on hearsay of people who met them and dealt with them. Now, I think what we cutting some corners, because I realize the time is
please, because yes, I mean, there's a lot we're going to talk about, but yes, please wrap up your.
So I think their mission and as how they see it is not to fully reform or dramatically reform the ways in which business was done during the Assad years. It is about the new interim government and HTS and members of HTS, elites of HTS, to get access to the rent-seeking and the resources that they see are going to be necessary for and will be generated by reconstruction. And that's basically the premise on which the committee started to try to make deals. They managed to do that in some cases, to the extent we know. It's very hard to say which deals were struck, because the interim government started to realize that these deals are highly controversial. Its dealings with security Shabiha guys like Fatih Sakr are controversial, but so are deals with people like Mohammed Hamshu. So it's very likely that the deals are not actually advertised, and they just pretend that these negotiations are still ongoing when there's a deal already. What do these deals look like concretely? It varies from player to player. But what seems to be happening is that the offer on the table is from the committee to these businessmen is we take 80 or 70% of your company, the assets, and you can get the rest. Now that's the start of the bargaining and the negotiations. Maybe you can say something more later about who accepted these terms, who resisted them, and where this is leading to.
Great. No, thank you, Renu. This is fascinating, the work of this committee, and it seems to be a bit of a, if I understand correctly what you're saying, it's a continuation of a form of network cronyism meets a sort of Syrian version of the Ritz-Carlton incident in Saudi Arabia, where there's a partial shakedown, but you can be in, you can survive to make money for another day. Very, very interesting, very worrying. It doesn't address as well the famed, everyone always talks about the Damascene, Lupine merchant classes, what remains of them. Also, I wanted to pinpoint something I think you mentioned in passing, but I think it's very interesting. Maybe we will come back to it. The new discourse emerging from Damascus, and particularly from Shara himself, he keeps talking about the state, right? I mean, almost raison d'etat, everything he does, you know, the prestige of the state, sending troops to Sueda is all about reestablishing the state. But it seems that the option of the state regaining these assets, regaining its sort of role, was maybe dismissed a bit too quickly. And maybe I use that because I want to now move to Nader Atasi. Nader is an economic historian who's been working a lot on, a scholar who's been focusing a lot on Syria's political economy and economic history, but also the history of economic thought in the modern Middle East. He's also a Basma Kudmani Fellow with us here at ARI. We're very happy to have him. Nader, I want to maybe pick up on perhaps, you know, where some of the questions that Renu left us with, which is this idea that in Renu's narrative argument, the new rulers found themselves, okay, what are the different trajectories? Well, maybe the easiest one we take, the one that suits us best right now, is to kind of control these networks of crony capitalists and try to get on with it and figure out that's the best way to kind of control the economy. You know, you've been looking at the sort of the trajectory of Syria's economy. I'd love to hear from you, what is, from your perspective, different path that Syria's transitional authorities could be taking, and what could they be prioritizing? And are there lessons from Syria's history about the role of the state? And maybe something that I think Salam mentioned and renewed, and it's an underlying tension point. Syria, particularly in the 60s, had this sort of historical role of the state as a developmental actor under Ba'athist ideology, but it was there. You know, you looked at it in farming, you looked at it even in housing and so forth. It was very, very present. But I think Renoud seemed to be mentioning, you know, this looks too much like the 60s Ba'athist, you know, so there's a bit of a legacy to these ideas that make the new rulers unwilling. And they're obviously an external faction. We live in a period where you want to please not just the sort of make sure that international lenders see you positively, but clearly they're playing to major international investors. So it's a continuation. But I'd love to hear from you, kind of from your perspective, your comments on what you've heard from Salam and Renewed. What are potential trajectories, and where do you see spaces? And if you have any insights on these famed merchant classes, I mean, did they disappear? Are they all part of these networks now? Is there something else that I mean, politically, are there sort of forces in Syrian society? I mean, back in the day in Iran and Turkey, we talk about the bazaar classes, right? I mean, are there political economy actors that haven't come up yet in the conversations that it's worth thinking of at this moment?
Great. Thanks so much, Nadim, for these questions. And thank you to APSN and ARI for the invitation to speak on this panel. Where should I begin? Okay, Syria has immediate and urgent economic concerns to deal with, such as the provision of electricity and water, the reintegration of the financial system, the stabilization of the currency. But I do think it's worth asking, kind of beyond that, what is the long-term vision for the Syrian economy? What sectors will be invested in, and who will benefit from those investments? In my mind, and this is something we can maybe discuss, but in my mind, there are two paths the Syrian economy can take. The first, the development of an economy that mostly benefits a set of rentier elites and foreign investors, which is kind of what we've been discussing up until this point. And the second is a vision that prioritizes national development. So unless the Syrian state sets clear parameters for what sectors and development goals it wants to prioritize, I think that the first model will win by default. And that's, I think, what we've been talking about up until now. By opening up Syria for business, I think investments will naturally be channeled towards the urban centers, which is Dr. Said already mentioned. And there will be an expansion in sectors like tourism, hospitality, services, and real estate. But the problem is I don't think these sectors are enough to absorb the approximately 10 million Syrians in need of employment. Only so many people can work in construction, even if there's a huge reconstruction effort. And sectors like tourism and real estate would inevitably, again, be concentrated around the major urban centers, leading to the continued peripheralization of the rest of Syria and new waves of rural-urban migration. I think the focus on those sectors will lead to an expansion of an informal sector, mostly based around services, and exacerbate wealth inequality. I think that the issue of cronyism is something we should, it's obviously something we've been discussing up until now. And I think there's a valid concern that the economic elites of the former regime will simply be replaced by a series of handpicked new elites close to the current government, or old elites like Hamsho and others. But I also think that even if investment was fully liberalized in a free market and favoritism was really dispensed with in favor of free competition, investments would still tend to flow towards those non-productive sectors. So I think this issue kind of goes beyond cronyism. I think that history has shown that it's only by kind of disciplining capital, channeling investments towards productive sectors like agriculture and industry, that countries like Syria have achieved a more equitable form of national development. Industry, manufacturing, and small to medium scale agriculture don't see some of the very high short-term rates of profit that other sectors do, but these are sectors that are nevertheless need to be prioritized from a national development perspective, because they're able to absorb large amounts of labor and are able to be located throughout the country and not only concentrated in the urban center. So they provide people with employment even in their local areas. And they also contribute to building economic sovereignty, as Syrians will become less reliant on imports for their basic needs. I think states have a variety of tools available to them to encourage investment in those sectors. They could subsidize them. They could provide financial incentives. They could give tax breaks. They could do a kind of classic infant industry protectionism. These are, all things that are part of the state developmentalist toolbox. I think industry and agriculture should also be a priority for those of us concerned with democracy and labor rights. Active unions and labor organizing are much more likely in sectors like manufacturing, whereas organizing in services and the informal sector is notoriously difficult. And if agriculture is prioritized and small and medium farmers are given access to resources and financing, they can strengthen their own unions and form regional agricultural cooperatives. So these sectors aren't only the most likely to be productive and provide employment to those who need it, they are also sectors where mass politics and organizing are at least possible, creating the potential for more inclusive governance and the possibility for pressure groups to ensure that it is not only capitalists who determine economic priorities. So I say all this because thus far we've not really seen a commitment from the Syrian state to develop these sectors. It is true that Syria has more pressing concerns, like the return of essential services to households and reconstruction, but still new projects are being announced that are not limited to these concerns, such as the recently announced new media city, and a growing interest expressed by the government in things like tech and AI. So not a lot has been said about investing in Syrian agriculture amidst one of the worst droughts on record this year. And little has been said about any plans for the revitalization of industry. So at the very least, we can say that the transitional government has not yet identified these sectors as priorities, as far as I can tell.
And Nader, just
since
to
we're
finish
encouraged
on
to
this,
think,
sorry to interrupt you, but you're right about the state. But I'm curious, where are people used to always talk about the sort of industrial lobby in Aleppo, right, before the war. There were, and that some of them had to move to Turkey, some of them whatever. Who represents, for instance, these interests today? We're not hearing them, at least from those of us, we're not hearing, for instance, is there anything left of sort of the organization of Syrian farmers that could bring these issues kind of more to bear? Do you have a sense about what is left of some of these movements or these networks of interest that are different from the crony capitalists, particularly of the sort of last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I think that like so many of these institutions that are important and were important are not only things like chambers of commerce and industry, but also like unions, farmers unions, labor unions are kind of regrouping because they're tainted by their association with the regime. So many of them were kind of, especially unions, were state backed, and so yeah, there's a kind of effort to kind of rebuild these institutions. I haven't heard much from the Aleppo industrialists myself. But like the public sector union is kind of reconstituting itself and finding a voice for itself to push for their demands. The student union, which was kind of very, famous for being tied to the regime in certain ways, is now kind of reconstituting itself as a free Syrian student union. We've seen, so there's different kinds of institutional organizations kind of re-emerging, but I think it's, as far as I can tell, it's quite slow. Can I talk a little bit about comparative?
Let's do it in the second round. Do you mind? Because we're going to just switch now. Because I think thank you. This is very, very helpful. And I think all three of you, we have a good sense of where Syria is at right now. This form of, new forms of network cronyism. Obviously, there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of talk of investments. But as I mentioned, it's not usually very conducive if your presidential palace gets bombed in the same week. But we're seeing all the elements of and hearing you talk about reconstruction, tourism, real estate. As a Lebanese, it brings back the 1990s. But we've also heard this in so many other contexts. So now I want to turn and look maybe a bit to what comes next, so to speak. Can we get Syria? It seems there's an agreement on this panel that the current trajectory is not what you would like to see happen for the country. But what are lessons from comparative examples? What are lessons that can be drawn to avoid, I would say, the current path that Syria is on that will just lead to a new form of network cronyism, perhaps with sort of investments in real estate, tourism, reconstruction, but end up basically with more Marota cities, which is basically what Assad was promoting a few years ago, or a new sort of Hamas and so forth, with a new sort of elite. So what, really reflecting on what are some comparative lessons that one can draw on, and what could constitute the basis for an alternative vision that gets developed and that get carried politically. And I'll start with you, Salam. I mean, you've edited a fascinating book looking at some of the lessons from Libya and Iraq. I mean, from your perspective, perhaps what are some of the red flags that you would be looking for in terms of predatory reconstruction, in terms of things that you're like, wait a minute, we've seen this before in other contexts, is exactly what you want to see avoid. And I know I interrupted you. You wanted to talk a bit more about some of the elites since December. I would say if you can, I mean, now I want to open, shorter answers and see if what does the future look like, and do you see any constellation of forces, opinions, narrative that can get Syria to perhaps change a bit its current trajectory in terms of the political economy?
Yes, thank you, Nadim, for the question. I will switch to Arabic again, just so everyone be prepared. في الحقيقة أنا بدي أذكر 3 نقاط ما انذكرت بشكل أساسي فيما يتعلق بالاقتصاد السياسي. أول شغلة هي لازم نذكر إنه نحن كتير حكينا عن الكرونيز تبع الأسد، بس ما حكينا عن الكرونيز اللي كانوا موجودين بالمناطق الثانية مثل منطقة إدلب ومثل منطقة الشمال الشرقي. واللي عم نشوفه حاليا من ديسمبر لهلا في نزوح أو في نزول من هدول رجال الأعمال اللي موجودين بإدلب، عم بيجوا على الشام وعم بيعملوا replacement، عم بيعملوا نوع من يعني هن عم بياخدوا مكان اللي كانوا موجودين قبل. فإذا عمليا هاي الكرونيز هي الشكل كان موجود بكل المناطق بسوريا، وهي السؤال هن لما بدنا نرجع نعمل سوريا وحدة، السؤال الكبير بدولة غنائمية ليست ديمقراطية، فهي كيف تقسيم الحصص. لحد الآن ما تم فعلا الحديث عن هذا الموضوع، أو لم يتم، ما في ملامح عن كيف شو هو شكل الباور شيرينج، خلينا نقول، أو تقاسم الغنائم للآن. وطالما هي تقاسم الاتفاق على تقاسم الغنائم غير موجودة، رح يضلوا في نفس المشاكل اللي عم نشوفها هلا بالسويدة، اللي شفناها بالساحل، اللي شفناها مع الأكراد وما غيرها. هي ليست فقط مسألة أقليات ومسألة إيديولوجيات، وإنما هي مسألة فقط، هي مسألة أهم بكتير، وهي عبارة عن كيف نحن حصصنا في الموجود، لأنه كل واحد منهم كان بالمنطقة تبعهم عبارة عن الشيف، يعني عبارة عن هو المنفذ. وبعدين يعني عندما راحت تجارة البنت الكبتاغون، في هي يعني قطاع اقتصادي كامل، يعني اللي كانوا منخرطين والدخل تبعهم جايين من هي، وين بدهم يروحوا، وين الدخل تبعهم. للأسف القيادة الجديدة ما قدمت حد الآن أي بدائل. بس رح أرجع لك مسألة إنه نحن ما عنا بسوريا مسألة مؤسسات، كان في عنا ضعف مؤسساتي خلال الحرب، كان بكل المناطق، وأيضا لحد الآن لم يتم بناء مؤسسات، وإنما صار في تهديم للمؤسسات الدولة. يعني حتى إذا في موجود موارد اقتصادية، لا يمكن للمؤسسات الحالية أن تدير هذه الموارد. هذا الحكي كنا نحكيه تماما عن استراتيجية إعادة الأعمار لبشار الأسد في 2018. ما في مؤسسات، ما في كوادر تقدر تدير إعادة الأعمار. الشغلة الثانية اللي نحن لاحظناها من نهاية السنة الماضية للآن، في مركزية شديدة باتخاذ القرارات، في مركزية شديدة ضمن دائرة، يعني إذا ما بنقول الشرع وأخوه واثنين غيره موجودين، هن اللي عم ياخذوا القرارات، هن عم بيوقعوا قرارات الاستثمار مع الشركات الأجنبية، هن اللي عم يعني ما في عندنا تشاركية. حكيت أنت عن نقطة التشاركية، ما فيها تشاركية حتى مع يعني خلينا نقول الاستشاريين والمستشارين والاقتصاديين وأهل العلم. في عنا كمان بالاستراتيجية اللي عم نشوفها مشاهداتنا كاقتصاديين واقتصاديات، انه في تركيز كتير على الاستثمار والدعم الخارجي، ولكن لا يوجد اي بديل عن الموضوع الموارد الداخلية. يعني ما في شيء، ما انحكى شيء عن السياسة المالية، شو هو الشكل الضريبي، ما هو موضوع التشغيل، شو عنا نحن خطط لموضوع التشغيل. تم تسريح العمال، تم تعطيل النقابات، ولكن لا يوجد هناك أي سياسة بديلة للتشغيل، لسوق العمل. كيف شكل سوق العمل؟ كيف هدول الاستثمارات بدهم يمتصوا هاي العمالة الموجودة؟ هناك تغييب كامل لحاجات الناس، مثل ما حكى نادر عن موضوع الاحتياجات الكبيرة لأشياء الأساسية، مثل البنية، مثل الكهرباء، المياه، الزبالة، إعادة بناء. التركيز بشكل أساسي على فئة المستثمرين وفئة الأغنياء. يعني لما ينحكى عن بناء أبراج داخل دمشق اللي هي غير مهدمة، في عندك الآن يعني هذا الكلام هو غير عادل. لما نشوف داريا على الأرض ولسه ما انبنت، لما ينحكى عن أنه نحن بدنا نعطي الاستثمار لإعادة بناء مبنى محافظة دمشق داخل المنطقة اللي هي ما تهدمت لشركة إماراتية، بينما جوبر مهدمة، كمان هي فيها عدم عدالة، فيها قصر نظر. لأنه إذا بدك تعتبر الشام رح تكبر، فأن من قصر النظر ما نفكر بتخطيط عمراني، تخطيط تطوير عمراني، ما في أي مخططات. نحن بنعرف كل الناس بيقولوا إنه بعد الوقت قصير، ما صار لهم أشهر على الحكم. صحيح، ولكن نحن نفتقد لرؤية، نفتقد لخطة، نفتقد لخطة يعرضوها، يشاركوها مع الناس، كيف بدهم يقوموا بعملية الأعمال، شو هي الأولويات، شو هن بدهم يعملوها. فهي بالنسبة للأساس. أنا بالنسبة إذا بتشوف مثلا، أنا بشوف اللي عصار بالعراق وليبيا، هدول أحد الأمثلة. إنه واللي هلق عم بيصير إنه الميليشيات اللي طلعت من الحرب ولإرضائها ضمن ما يسمى بنوع من power sharing agreement، يعني بما معنى آم، اتفاقية تقاسم غنائم، حتى مثل ما اتفاقية الطائف بلبنان. خلت شرعنت هدول اللي هن في منهم كتير متورطين بجرائم حرب، عطتهم مناصب وخلتهم يكونوا جزء من الدولة، واللي هن الآن عم ينهبوا من الدولة من الداخل. يعني بليبيا الميليشيات تأخذ رواتبها من الدولة الليبية، يعني هن صاروا جزء من الدولة ولكن هن غير دولة. نفس الشيء بالعراق. فأنا اللي بدي أقوله، إذا بدنا نتعلم من هونيك، نحن لازم نبني المؤسسات بالدولة بالدرجة الأولى، لازم يصير في عدالة انتقالية، ولازم العدالة الانتقالية يكون في حدود للمسامحة للجرائم الحرب لحتى ما ينعادوا، مثل ما شفنا باليومين الماضيين بالجنوب، ومثل ما شفنا بالساحل، ومثل ما شفنا بالمناطق الكردية كمان. فإذا عمليا هذا كتير مسألة مهمة. الشغلة الثانية بالنسبة للسياسة الاقتصادية اللي لحد الآن إذا بنشوفها، ما في سياسة اقتصادية واحدة، في تخبط اقتصادي. يعني هن بيعملوا إعلان إنه نعمل اقتصاد سوق، ولكن بنفس الوقت بيقوموا بمثلا التحكم بقيمة الليرة، وهذا ليس ما له علاقة باقتصاد السوق. بيقوموا مثلا صاروا بدهم ياخذوا يرجعوا بالقطاع الزراعي يشتروا القمح من الفلاحين بأسعار محددة. فهذا ما خلينا نقول اسلوب تول اقتصاديه، اقتصاد حر. فاذا عمليا ما في وضوح حتى بالسياسه الاقتصاديه، في تخبط بالسياسه الاقتصاديه. فعمليا الشيء الوحيد اللي عملوه واضح هو فعلا مثل ما حكيت بالبدايه انت نديم، هو الخصخصه، هو بيع. حتى ما بيستخدموا كلمه خصخصه، بيقولوا بيع مؤسسات القطاع العام، ما بنعرف لمين، بظروف غامضة، ما في شفافية، وما بنعرف قديش بأي أسعار. يعني هي الشغلة الثانية الأولى. والشغلة الثانية، صار في تسريح كتير كبير للعمال، وهدول العمال ما بنعرف إمتى بدهم يرجعوا، وعطلوا لهم النقابات اللي هن على يفترض.
سيد، عم تسمعوا سلام أو no you can't hear okay سلام we lost you there for a second. بدك تحبي تخلصي فكرتك؟
رح خلّ بس بالنهاية. فإذا اللي مشان هيك إذا بدنا نستفيد من تجربة العراق اللي هي اتبعت سياسة تحرير تجاري كتير فج بعد الحرب، خلّت الصناعة المحلية كلّياتها ما تعطيها فرصة بالنهوض. فكمان نحن لازم ناخد بعين الاعتبار، نحن لازم ندعم القطاع الإنتاجي بسوريا، القطاع الصناعي، القطاع الزراعي، ونعمل دعم لإلهم. لازم نحاول ندعم الطبقات الفقيرة، ولازم نحاول ما نقطع يعني ما نعطي مصادر الدخل للاجئين والديسبلي، يعني النازحين في سوريا. غير هيك ما فيك تبني اقتصاد في سوريا. وما لازم نعتمد على التمويل الكبير من الخارج، لأنه نحن ما عندنا قدرة مؤسساتية لإدارة هي الموارد، وإنما رح يصير في مثل بأفغانستان درجة عالية من الفساد، والهيدي المصاري الكبيرة اللي بدها تجي بيروح جزء كتير منها فقط للطبقة الصغيرة، ولن تصل إلى من يحتاجها، ولا للاقتصاد للقطاعات اللي بحاجة لها. شكرا.
اوكي شكرا سلام. building on what you said, I mean, actually, just to kind of confirm, there were a series of decisions that were published on July 7th, but supposedly were taken in late June, forming a higher council for economic development, creating a Syrian sovereign fund, everything under control of the president. I mean, it does sound like the sort of traditional recipe of privatization, tightly controlled, but we're still waiting. As you mentioned, there's no discussions within these institutions about what the national priorities are. And it seems it's happening fire sale before the sort of strategy of what the economy is. You talked about Iraq, you talked about Lebanon, Renewed. I mean, you've done a lot of work on post-war Lebanon, the economy, the evolution of this. I mean, listening to Salam, this idea, you know, do you see it mostly evolving that Syria will follow what we saw in Lebanon in a way that the way of sort of buying the peace is you just distribute some of these benefits. So now you have the network from Idlib who kind of comes to Damascus. Maybe in the future they will have to give some to those who are close to the current, let's say, Kurdish leadership, give something maybe to the Druze leadership. We've already seen the deals with some of the former business people who were close to the old regime. I mean, that's sort of the image that's sort of emerging. But I'd love for you sort of, given what you worked on and studied in other contexts, what would be some of the things that you really want to raise the flags, around? But also maybe we can start addressing some of the questions from the audience. And there's a question from Lama about the role of Syrian diaspora. And we've seen a lot of return visits by Syrian business people. Obviously, these would be different scale than, let's say, giving port rights to Dubai ports or giving, these massive, again, something that we saw as well in the past with previous diasporas in Lebanon, in Libya. Do you have any insights on that? Can the Syrian diaspora articulate perhaps a different model of the political economy, different sorts of investments that are perhaps smaller in scale, more locally owned, more distributed? And one last question for you to kind of quickly address. ضعف المؤسسات, the weakness of institutions. And I mean, this is something that I think has echoed a lot in Iraq and in Lebanon. Any lessons that we've learned from these countries about how to strengthen institutions in periods of transition so that they don't end up being, an example where you just appoint kind of who you appoint, politically convenient for you to have. So they have all the form of a modern state, but none of the actual functions. All that in 3 to 4 minutes, Renu, please. You're muted.
I was saying that's quite a challenge. Thank you for all these questions. I just want to clarify something first in response to what Nader said earlier on. With my emphasis, and that goes generally my work on cronyism and rent seeking and so on. That's not to imply that is the or even the most important cause of unproductive rent-seeking economies. I think there's a logic to capital as well that I'm sure is very relevant in the Syrian case as well. That brings about kind of warped compositions of an economy like that of Syria. So having said that, I still think the cronyism and the rent seeking is important within these parameters, and possibly also linked to it. I think it is an amplifying phenomenon. It makes it worse, apart from the factors that you looked at, Nader. So with the risk of simplifying things a bit, but I'm excused by the few minutes that I only have. I think, you could distinguish roughly between two kinds of forms of rent-seeking networked cronyism. One is a highly fragmented form of networked cronyism, and then there's another ideal type on the other side of the continuum as a heavily centralized, domineered by either the state or by state elites, very centralized. Now, when I talk about fragmented, when I think of fragmented cronyism, I think of Lebanon, and we all know what a disaster that brings about. It goes at the expense of governance. It undermines governance. It undermines public trust. The legitimacy of the state is virtually absent. It causes endless frustration, and not irrelevant to economic growth and the size of the cake, if you like. It causes that cake to shrink, and I called it in a paper on Lebanon, the goose with the golden eggs that basically was killed by the political elites and business elites in Lebanon who took part in that endless haggling and game of dividing up the spoils, muhassasa. So that's Lebanon. Now, more towards the centralized form of rentier networked rent seeking is Iraq. Not because of political reasons, I think. Although you could argue that Iraq has a longer and a stronger state building tradition compared to Lebanon. But it's mostly and reducing, sounding a bit reductionist, but it comes from the centralization of the revenues coming from oil and gas, and they go to the state. And that brings the Iraqi case after 2003 more to the kind of ideal type of a centralized distribution of rents. Now, what I think is happening at the moment is that HTS and the interim government is essentially steering towards hoping to build a more centralized form of rent seeking, networked rent seeking. And it actually, in that sense, looks very similar to what the Assad regime was doing in its final years under Yasser Ibrahim. And it's a suffocating form of rent seeking. It goes at the expense of everybody, including the Damascene, the Aleppo merchant class. It leaves for very little drops of resources left for anybody, high levels of poverty, and so on. I wonder whether they will be successful in doing this for a couple of reasons. To build a more centralized form of rent seeking, networked rent seeking. One is it won't be tolerated by the international community, by donors, by those giving aid. More importantly, I think, and that's also a reason why businessmen now take part in these negotiations, or at least one reason. They are basically betting for time. They are thinking that, for now, these are the terms, the 80, 70, or the 20 or 30% that they get of the crumbs of the companies that they used to control. But in time, the state will. There are so many factors already lining up that undermines the power of the central government. These are not just economic factors, but everything to do with the geopolitical context and what have you. We won't really get into that. And that basically allows these business elites to improve their bargaining power in over time. So I see a Lebanese style distribution of rent seeking networks, fragmented rent seeking as more plausible. Is it desirable? Well, of course not. It undermines governance. Even in the centralized form, it leads to authoritarian excesses. but also in the fragmented form, but in a different way. You get a Lebanese kind of authoritarianism as opposed to, pre-2003 Saddam Hussein style of authoritarianism, or indeed Assad's authoritarianism. What can the diaspora do in this context? I think it's an enormously important player for many reasons. They have leverage, much more so compared to people who are now in Syria and who live in 90% of poverty, under the poverty line. They have resources, significant resources, which are very important, especially when aid is still to come in, when other resources are still having to line up with the lifting of sanctions and so on. So in this moment, I think the remittances are terribly important, and the financial kind of liberalization and lifting of sanctions on financial flows will hammer this home to the current government. Like, we have to take this into account. We benefit from remittances. We are relying on remittances. So the diaspora, I think, should be very active in being vocal, in being reconnecting with Syria. And also, get very much involved in setting up local business communities, for example, business organizations rivaling the Chamber of Commerce, chambers of commerce that are now again being staffed, controlled by HTS government linked businessmen. And in their new homes, if you like, in Europe, in the West, elsewhere, I think they are in a unique position to lobby their governments, Western governments, and to make them aware of, you can't just do business as usual. You can't come up with this worn-out Washington consensus and all the cliches of how development should take place. You really have to fight for it. You have to be conditional. You have to insist on encouraging productive sectors, agriculture, industry, and so on, and not let things like laissez-faire like develop out of their own, because they will definitely go in the wrong direction.
Great. No, thank you very much. And turning to you, Nadia, about this sort of, there's always this sense of, okay, going back to this comment about the role of institution and historical, are there examples from Syria's history, narratives that should be told more today, perhaps from pre-Ba'ath times, perhaps things under Ba'ath that were not totally corrupted back in the day, to sort of create that space for, interest groups to become more vocal. I mean, Renud was mentioning, the role in as well, the chambers of commerce, these things. Are there examples where, I'd love for you to sort of maybe reflect a bit on some of the alliances that one could imagine in Syria pushing for a different model. And also, as someone who, a couple of the questions in the Q&A are talking about what's the time horizon here? We started with that. This is sort of we're not yet even in a post-conflict situation. It's a sort of a transition, but it's a transition to what? It's not very clear. So obviously it's hard to have a clear vision of the political economy. But maybe as a historian, I mean, what do you think should be the sort of time unit we think of, those of us who are trying to work on Syria's political economy at this stage? What are things that we should be insisting on to start seeing happening in the coming period? What are some things that you would like to see, initiative, or maybe examples from the past that you think, this needs to be revived at this particular moment as an alternative path?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Where should I begin? So I think that in terms of the time horizon and like, is it too soon to be talking about what the plan is and things like that? I think that there are these examples of countries that kick the can down the road using these rent-seeking models, either centralizing distribution of rents or the fragmented in Lebanon, as we've been discussing. I mean, perhaps this is optimistic of me, but I think that these I think that those models cannot be sustainable for Syria for that long because, I mean, Lebanon is a small country with a small population, and it still, didn't work there eventually when the economy exploded. As we said, Iraq had its oil rents to kind of distribute, but I just don't know if there are enough rents to go around to create a kind of robust centralized distribution of rents. While so many people are in poverty and unemployed, I just don't see that as sustainable in the long run. I think that they need to be pushed to come up with a plan, as we've been speaking, to kind of invest in those sectors that will lessen wealth inequality, prioritize national development, and on the history, in terms of history and Syria's history, there is, the transitional government has been using this discourse that they will transform Syria from its socialist past to a free market economy. We've already kind of talked about, how actually the Assad regime was dabbling with neoliberalism in his tenure. But there's this idea that particularly by a certain class of Syrians, that before the Ba'ath era, Syria was this kind of free market merchant utopia. But that's simply not the case. In the 1950s, the early Syrian Republic embraced national developmentalism and state intervention in the economy, just as other countries did, on both sides of the Cold War. Like, this was the norm. In 1953, in particular, Syria was the first country in the Arab world to establish a state-owned central bank. In the 50s, Syria left the currency and economic union with Lebanon in order to pursue its own industrialization goals without being flooded by manufactured goods from Beirut. And it's the 1950 Syrian constitution, which was the first to be promulgated after Syria's independence from the French, and which, the current transitional constitution is said to derive inspiration from, that states, and I quote, "The state should supervise and regulate the national economy in order to achieve a decent standard of living for people, ensure investment in land, advancement in industry and trade, and the provision of employment for all citizens." So these ideals were championed by state officials as well as pushed from below, right? Like, you were asking about the alliances, like it's true. This is the time when the student movement, the labor movement, the agricultural movement under Akram Khodani, like there was pressure from below for even the kind of liberal classical Syrian elites of the early Syrian Republic to adopt a kind of state-led development perspective. And so those were the kind of coalitions that were formed and that were later, I think that in the Ba'ath era, you could talk about it much more as those groups were just co-opted by the state rather than it being a partnership. So I think if Syria, wants to achieve economic recovery alongside social justice and a more equitable distribution of wealth, it should embrace these ideas from the early republic and not hold on to the discredited dogmas of, free market development.
Great. No, thank you very much. I think it's true. It's super interesting to rediscover some of the early history and maybe create alternative narratives. So I want to give you now kind of last word to each for maximum 1 minute, and then we wrap up. Either if you want to address any particular question you saw in the Q&A, but perhaps to have you engage in I think at the heart of the tension of this conversation is, what do we do now in these uncertain moments? How do you ensure that this sort of dynamic that is slowly taking shape does not lead to sort of the worst case scenario? And I'm curious if you have, an idea you'd like to push forward that you think something that people should be concentrating on. And it could be like, well, the best way to kind of rebuild state institutions at this point is X, or priority should be, and the narrative should all be about creating employment. There should be a clear message, and based on that, you can sort of build back around it, that this should be the issue. Where, for me, clearly the message coming from Damascus right now is investment, right? One can understand that. They need the money. They even need the money to pay public salaries. But recognizing all the limitations, the challenges of the current period and the questions, Israel is bombing, it's occupying. They don't have access yet to the revenues from the northeast oil fields or the eastern oil fields, and who knows when they would have that. what would you prioritize? What would you like to see happen, not in a few years, but actually right now, that would signal some potentiality to avoid, I think, some of the, worst case or bad cases that we've seen in other parts? I'll start with you, Salam, and then Renud, and we'll conclude with Nader. Really, 1 minute each, or if you prefer to address some of the questions. And just I realize we didn't talk about the role of international actors because, as Lama said, we're going to have another panel specifically focused on that because there's a lot to unpack. Obviously, it intersects. We didn't talk about the role of humanitarianism as well in sort of post-conflict settings, where I think we can discuss a lot. But I think it's interesting to focus on sort of the domestic institutions and the domestic networks that are developed. Salam, in 1 minute or less.
الشرع حكى بالبداية أنه هو بده يحكي عن عقد اجتماعي جديد. هذا العقد نحن ما بنعرف ملامحه ولا تم الحديث عنه. بسوريا بدنا بحاجة لحوار اجتماعي، بدنا بحاجة لعقد اجتماعي بمشاركة حقيقية. لازم يصير خطط إعادة الأعمار وعملية إعادة الأعمار بتشاركية على مستوى البلديات، على مستوى المناطق، وثم على مستوى الدولة. لا يجب التعويل كثيرا على الاستثمار الخارجي، لأنه بوجود مثل ما حكى نديم الكونفليكت، بوجود إسرائيل والضربات الإسرائيلية وعدم الاستقرار السياسي داخل سوريا نفسها، ما فينا نتأمل بأي وعود، لأنه كل اللي صار حتى الآن فقط وعود، لا يوجد فعلا على الأرض أي شيء. فإذا عمليا يجب الاعتماد على النفس، الاعتماد على income generating activities، يعني الأنشطة الإنتاجية اللي حتى نعتمد على نفسنا. والريميتنسز، يعني التحويلات الخارجية لازم تنتقل من فقط لصرفها للاستهلاك، لا بناء مشاريع إنتاجية صغيرة. وخلينا نبلش صغير ونكبر. community based projects ومحليات أهم بكتير ما ناخد فند كبير ويصير في corruption وما توصل للمناطق اللي نحن بحاجة لها. إذا ديمقراطية تشاركية وحوار وطني وعقد اجتماعي عادل.
شكرا سلام. واضح جدا وملهم. رينود, over to you.
Yeah, can you hear me, or is it muted? Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to second Salam on the need or to stress participatory development and getting a bit empower a constituency locally for pressing for the kind of developments that policies that would be a much better alternative than what has been done so far. Now, having said that, I also think we haven't done that really during our session, but I think we also should give the current government still a little bit more the benefit of the doubt. We are only 7 months or so into the post-Assad era. Any government regime would struggle by now, particularly given all the challenges that you mentioned, Nadim, as we speak. Having said that, the problem is that of path dependency. At this moment, as we speak, things are being done, perhaps intended as a stopgap kind of solution. Let's talk to these rich guys associated with the former regime. We don't like them, but what can we do at this point? So if that's the case, even so, you empower these elites to get back and to start setting the terms of what is going to come in the future. Now, to counterweight that, I don't think there is a one miracle kind of silver bullet. But I think it's important to also realize that this moment is not just a moment of chaos and what have you and misery and challenges. It's also an enormous opportunity in any country's history. A revolution has occurred here. At least some sort of a revolution, at least on a political front, like a regime that was thought to be entrenched in power has been overthrown, and that leaves open a lot of opportunities. The problem is, you need to seize these opportunities, and I think the chances of steering towards a more productive economy and well, sorry for the cliche, but better or good governance, participatory development, addressing inequality, poverty, what have you, is to build and empower a constituency that benefits and presses for these policies. So from that perspective, I would emphasize the need for empowering the diaspora, highly skilled, educated, them to come back to Syria is going to be crucial. Empower them to organize themselves and build coalitions with Syrians who remained and who are important to the economy, including the now marginalized, it seems, business elites of Damascus and Aleppo who remained. So you have to build a constituency for better policies.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. Nader, last word goes to you.
Thank you. I mean, that was so comprehensive. I agree with what both of you said. I don't have much to add, but one thing I would say, and what I was trying to emphasize is, Syria is an agricultural economy. You should invest in agriculture. You should, and there's easy ways to do this that aren't that expensive. You can encourage financial institutions to provide cheap credit. You could help with irrigation. You could simplify property rights so that they're not kind of holding people back from working their lands. But this needs to be a priority for sovereign economic development. It'll provide people with jobs and where they're from. It'll lessen the rural-urban migration. I think it's like, if we're thinking of what's the first step that will kind of reverberate and help other sectors, like that has to be it, and not these kind of mega projects that Salam was referring to as well.
Great. No, I want to thank you all and also thank Lama and APSN as well for this great partnership. There are a lot of great ideas here. I think things as well that we will take to the next session where we talk about how international community, international players can maybe facilitate, so they even, the issue of investment, how they can invest these into a new social contract, how to think about models of economies that are bottom up that tend to be more resilient than big investments where at the first bomb they end up disappearing. The issue of how to sort of empower diaspora, how to connect it to this new form of political economy, not just as a source of capital, but also as a human resource, but also Nader for reminding us of the importance of certain sectors, and here particularly the agricultural sector in terms of what it represents, even in terms of use of land and who is at the heart of the rebuilding. Perhaps we didn't spend as much time because it's impossible an hour and a half thinking about the major challenges of the political economy of reconstruction in Syria and who will be left out. But this is definitely something that we will be monitoring and maybe for future sessions. So this to be continued. Please follow these webinars. And thank you again to our speakers. وتصبحون على خير وخاصة تصبح سوريا على خير. I hope in better days. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful discussion.